You're a mechanic? Nadine's voice carried just enough music in it to make the word sound like a punchline. She didn't whisper it. She didn't need to. The couple at the next table glanced over, and the flicker of a smile crossed the woman's face before she looked away. Callum didn't flinch. He set his water glass down with the same steady hands that had rebuilt a transmission that morning, looked across the candlelit table at the woman Marco had described as successful and real, and said, "Yeah, my own shop." She nodded the way people nod when they've already stopped listening. Drop a comment right now telling us where you're watching from, because this story about a man who got laughed at in front of a full restaurant is about to show you exactly what happens when the wrong person gets underestimated at the worst possible moment. His name was Callum Bryce, 38 years old, broad-shouldered, unhurried, with the kind of quiet that didn't come from having nothing to say, wore a charcoal blazer that had seen better decades but was clean and pressed, and his dark jeans were the good ones. The pair Rosie had pointed at last Christmas and said, "Those ones, Dad, those are the fancy ones." He'd laughed then. He thought about that now. He'd almost canceled 3 times. Not because he was afraid of the date. Callum Bryce had stood in the middle of a pit lane with a car on fire and a race on the line and made decisions in under 4 seconds. He wasn't afraid of dinner. He'd almost canceled because Rosie had a slight fever Tuesday, and even though it broke by Wednesday morning and she'd spent Thursday at school and Friday at her friend Amara's house, perfectly fine, demanding chicken nuggets and drawing pictures of horses, he still felt it. That pull. The one that said, "What are you doing out here when she's in there?" Marco had called at 6:15. "You're going," Marco had said, before Callum spoke a word. "She's fine. Amara's mum texted me. Rosie ate 2 plates of nuggets and beat Amara at every game they played, and she is currently, and I quote, refusing to go to sleep because she's the winner." Callum had stood in his garage in the blazer, one hand resting on the roof of a half-finished Volvo, smiling despite himself. "She also told me," Marco continued, "and I'm passing this on officially, that her dad deserves someone who makes him laugh and also is very nice." That was the thing about Rosie. She didn't argue. She didn't push. She just stated what she believed to be true, with the unshakable certainty of someone who had never been given a reason to doubt her own judgment. And somehow that was always enough. Callum had locked up the garage, driven into the city, and paid $7 to park 2 streets from the restaurant because the closer spots charged by the hour. Saffron and salt looked exactly the way Marco had described it. Fancy, but not stupid fancy, which in practice meant polished marble, floors, low amber lighting, and a menu that listed ingredients Callum didn't recognize in a font that suggested this was intentional. The host had looked him over on arrival with eyes trained to assess and had taken an extra half-second doing it, the way people do when they're recalibrating which level of service to apply. Callum had smiled pleasantly and given his name and been shown to a corner table near the window. He'd ordered water, looked at the wine list, noted the prices, set it down. He'd looked around the room once, the kind of sweep you do without thinking, reading exits, reading flow, reading where sound traveled and where it got absorbed. And then he'd looked at his hands on the table. There was a faint trace of grease along his left thumbnail that he'd missed in the scrubbing. He'd looked at it for a moment, then turned his palm over and left his hand where it was. He was what he was. That had never been the problem. Nadine had arrived 8 minutes late, which was exactly the amount of time required to ensure someone was already seated and already waiting and already aware of the power geometry. She moved through the restaurant the way people move when they know they're being watched and have decided to agree with it. Her dress was deep green and expensive. Her heels announced each step on the marble. She'd seen him from across the room, and just for a moment, just one, something in her expression had shifted. She'd seen him from across the room, and something in her expression had shifted. Not dramatically, not in a way that anyone watching would have caught. Just a small recalibration, the kind that happened behind the eyes. A reassessment. A quiet closing of a door. She crossed the room anyway, smiled with all the right muscles, and sat down. "Callum," she said his name like she was trying it on. "That's me." He stood briefly as she sat. An instinct, something his mother had installed so deeply it operated without instruction, and she noticed it the way people notice things that surprise them, which is to say, she filed it away without acknowledging it. The first 10 minutes were what they were. She asked the standard questions in the standard order, and he answered them honestly and without embellishment, because he didn't know any other way to answer questions. Occupation, area, how he knew Marco, whether he owned or rented. That last one came wrapped in a smile that had nothing warm inside it, and Callum felt it land, but let it pass. The way you let a cold draft pass when opening a door isn't worth the effort. She told him about her restaurants, 2 franchises, a catering arm, a lifestyle platform with a following she mentioned once and then mentioned again from a different angle. She was good at what she did. He could see that clearly. The way she described the catering operation had the compressed fluency of someone who'd solved the same problems enough times to have stopped being impressed by them. Under different circumstances, across a different table, he might have found that genuinely interesting. But she kept glancing at his hands, not subtly, not the way you glance at something involuntarily and look away. She looked the way people look when they want you to know they're looking, when the looking is itself the message. "Occupational hazard, I suppose," she said, gesturing vaguely toward them, and the smile she used was the social equivalent of a shrug. Plausible deniability dressed as lightness. Callum looked at his hands, then back at her. "Comes with the work," he said. She hummed in a way that wasn't agreement and lifted her menu. If you've ever watched someone decide you're not worth the effort of basic decency and just kept sitting there anyway, stay with this story. Because what's coming in the next few parts is going to be the most satisfying thing you've watched this week. Subscribe with the bell on so you don't miss the moment this entire room turns around. The sommelier arrived, and Nadine ordered without looking up, a specific vintage by name, and then turned to Callum with her eyebrows raised in the pleasant, waiting way that meant the choice was his. He scanned the list briefly, felt the prices do what prices do, and told the sommelier he was fine with water. "Thanks." The sommelier nodded without expression and left. Nadine watched this happen. Then she picked up her phone. It was brief, the kind of motion people perform when they want it to seem reflexive rather than deliberate. A glance down, a few taps, a faint curve at the corner of her mouth that suggested she'd said something to someone and was waiting to see if it landed. Callum caught the angle of the phone. He didn't need to see the screen. He thought about Rosie, not as an escape from the moment, as an anchor to it. Rosie, who had packed her overnight bag for Amara's with the focused efficiency of a small person who took logistics seriously. Rosie, who had hugged him at the door and then pulled back and straightened his lapel without being asked, the way Elena used to do, and said, "You look good, Dad. Go have fun." 7 years old and already the most grounded person he knew, he thought about what she'd said through Marco, that her dad deserved someone who was nice. He looked across the table at Nadine Ashford, who was now tilted slightly toward the adjacent couple, saying something low that produced a small laugh from the woman, who then glanced at Callum in the particular way that meant she'd been given something to look at. The man with her didn't laugh. He looked at his plate instead, and Callum respected that without making anything of it. The restaurant moved around them. Glasses rang. The kitchen breathed warmth through the service door. Somewhere in the building, behind a paneled wall and a private entrance, a dinner for 50 motorsport professionals was reaching its second course. Callum didn't know that yet. He just sat with his water and his hands and the blazer Rosie had approved, and waited to see what kind of evening this would become. He didn't have to wait much longer. He didn't have to wait much longer. Nadine set her phone face down on the table with the deliberate care of someone who had just sent something they were pleased with, and turned back to him with a smile that had been freshly applied. She picked up her wine glass, tilted it once in the candlelight, the way people do when they've learned that gesture from somewhere and adopted it as personality, and said, "So, a mechanic. Is that something you always wanted, or—" She let the sentence trail in a direction that finished itself. Callum considered the question the way he considered most things, without rushing it. "I wanted to work with engines," he said. "That part stayed consistent." "Right," she nodded. "And there's good money in it?" "I always wonder with trades. My father said trades were the smart choice, but he said that about everything practical. He was very—" She searched for the word with her eyes on the ceiling. "Sensible." The way she said sensible made it clear it was not a compliment. "Some months are better than others," Callum said. "Of course." She lifted her wine again. "It must be very freeing, not having to think about shareholders or quarterly projections, just the work in front of you." He looked at her steadily. "Something like that." She was performing now, not for him specifically, but for the radius around her that she seemed to experience as a permanent audience. The adjacent table had settled into that particular stillness of people who are pretending not to listen while listening completely. The woman had stopped eating. Her partner had found something absorbing in his bread plate. Nadine leaned back in her chair and crossed one leg over the other, and something in the gesture signaled a gear change, a decision made, a filter removed. "Can I be honest?" she said. Callum said nothing, which she took as yes. "Marco told me you were interesting. His word, interesting. And I trust Marco mostly. But I think Marco's definition of interesting and mine might be—" She turned her wine glass slowly on the tablecloth. "Different." "Probably," Callum agreed. The honesty seemed to throw her briefly. She'd expected something. Defensiveness, maybe, or the particular wounded stiffness of a man who needed her to think well of him. What she got instead was a man who looked as though he'd already accounted for the possibility of this conversation and had made his peace with it in the car park. She recalibrated. And because recalibration without escalation wasn't in her vocabulary tonight, she escalated. "I just think—" She glanced down at his jacket sleeve, then back up. "We're probably in different places, lifestyle-wise, ambition-wise. It's not a judgment, it's just I've worked very hard to build a certain kind of life, and I'm at the point where I need someone who matches that, energetically." The word energetically did the job she needed it to do. The woman at the adjacent table made a sound that was almost a laugh and converted it poorly into a cough. Callum felt something move through him. Not anger, because anger would have required him to care what Nadine Ashford thought of him, and he was surprised to find he didn't. Not really. What he felt was closer to a specific sadness, not for himself, for the version of this evening that Rosie had imagined when she'd straightened his lapel at the door. That version deserved better than this table. He picked up his water glass and drank from it. "That's fair," he said. It was the wrong answer again. She needed friction, and he kept refusing to provide it, and this seemed to irritate her in a way that his wounded pride would not have. She picked up her phone, not hiding it this time, photographed the table between them with a quick, practiced motion, typed something, and set it back down. From 2 tables away, someone exhaled a short laugh. Callum didn't look. He looked at the room instead. It was a reflex from another life, the habit of reading an environment completely before committing to any action within it. Exits, staff movement patterns. The acoustics, which were live enough that Nadine's voice carried further than she probably realized. The service door to the kitchen, which had been swinging with the steady rhythm of a busy dinner operation. He noticed that the rhythm had changed. In the last 90 seconds, the service door had stopped moving. A sous chef had appeared in the gap, spoken to a server with urgency visible in the angle of his shoulders, and disappeared. The server had gone directly to the duty manager's station without stopping. Something in the kitchen was wrong. Callum didn't know what yet. He just filed it, the way he'd always filed things, quietly, completely, without deciding what to do with it, until the moment required a decision. That moment was coming faster than anyone at his table knew. That moment was coming faster than anyone at his table knew. But Nadine wasn't finished yet. She'd ordered a starter he hadn't touched the menu for, something architectural on a slate tile that arrived with a server who recited its components in French, and she'd watched Callum's face during the recitation with the focused attention of someone collecting evidence. He hadn't reacted. He'd thanked the server by name. The name was on a small badge, and Callum had the habit of using them, and the server had seemed briefly startled by this, the way people are startled by small courtesies in environments that don't expect them. Nadine had noted this too, filed it in the wrong column. "You know," she said, dragging a fork through something that cost more than Callum's hourly rate, "I did some events work in motorsport last year. Corporate hospitality, the money those people spend on a single evening is—" She shook her head with a laugh that was really just breath. "You can't imagine." "Sounds like good business," Callum said. "It was extraordinary. The details they care about. The level of—" She searched again. Expectation. Everything had to be perfect. These weren't people who understood the concept of good enough. She said it pleasantly. The implication arrived separately, like a second course. Callum looked at her, at the practiced way she held her fork, at the ring on her right hand that caught the candlelight every time she moved, which was frequently, at the small, satisfied curl at the corner of her mouth that had been there since the phone photograph and hadn't quite left. He thought about good enough. He thought about the morning Elena died, 4 years ago March, when the hospital consultant had used that exact phrase about the road conditions that day. Visibility was good enough, the report would say. The surface was good enough. The junction was adequately signed, and how he had sat in a plastic chair in a corridor that smelled of industrial cleaner, and felt the entire architecture of his life shift on its foundations. And not one single thing about his engineering background, his career, his status, his salary had mattered even slightly. After that, good enough had seemed like plenty. "Must have been interesting work," he said. Nadine smiled with her mouth. "It paid well. That's what matters, isn't it, at a certain point?" She glanced past him then, a practiced social sweep of the room that managed to be both casual and pointed, and her eyes landed on something she could use. She tilted her chin very slightly toward Callum's jacket and said, to the general direction of the adjacent table, rather than to him specifically, "Do you think the dress code here is a suggestion, or—" The woman at the adjacent table laughed this time. Properly. A short, bright sound that she pulled back quickly, but not quickly enough. Her partner set his fork down. Callum felt it. The particular exposure of a public moment, not physical, but social, the kind that strips a layer of something you can't name. He'd felt it once before, a long time ago, in a paddock in Monaco when a rival team's principal had made a comment in front of a crowd of 50 people about Callum's background, his accent, the university he hadn't attended. He'd felt it then too, that same thin, cold feeling. He'd won the race that afternoon by 11 seconds. He straightened slightly in his chair, not in agitation, but in the unconscious way of a man recalling his own posture, and looked at Nadine Ashford with the steady, unhurried attention that had once made team owners twice his age choose their words more carefully. "I think," he said, without particular emphasis, "that dress codes matter less than people imagine." It wasn't a fight. He hadn't raised his voice, hadn't leaned forward, hadn't done anything that could be held against him. But something in the delivery, its complete absence of apology, landed differently than she'd expected, and for just a fraction of a second, a different kind of recalibration moved across her face. Then she picked up her phone again, and the moment closed. From across the room, a man in a dark suit appeared at the duty manager's station. Not a guest. His posture was operational, not social. He spoke in the clipped, pressured way of someone reporting a problem they don't have a solution to. The duty manager listened, and the color in her face changed incrementally in the way color changes when something manageable becomes something else. Callum watched the exchange for 3 seconds. Then he looked back at his water glass, and then at the service door, which had now been completely still for 4 minutes. 4 minutes was a long time for a kitchen that had been running at full pace 60 seconds before that. Something was wrong. He was certain of it now. Something was wrong. He was certain of it now. The duty manager had moved from her station to the kitchen threshold in the deliberate, controlled way of someone trying very hard not to communicate urgency through their body while feeling nothing but. She pushed the service door open a precise 6 inches, exchanged 4 words with whoever was on the other side, and let it close. Then she stood with her back to the dining room for a moment, facing the wall, which was the posture of a person doing rapid arithmetic on a problem with no clean answer. Callum tracked this without appearing to track it. Across the table, Nadine had moved on from the dress code comment with the ease of someone who treats social injuries the way she treated most inconveniences, as things that happen to other people. She was talking about a renovation she was doing on an investment property, a conversation she was having largely with herself, which suited him well enough. The man in the dark suit reappeared from the direction of the kitchen corridor. He was speaking into a phone now, one finger pressed to his free ear, and the words Callum caught across the ambient noise of the dining room were fragmented but sufficient. Technical fault. 40 minutes. We cannot wait 40 minutes. Callum set his water glass down slowly, a seized relief valve. That was his first instinct, the one that arrived before he'd consciously assembled the evidence. The stilled kitchen, the sudden stop in food service, the duty manager's arithmetic, the 40-minute window that ruled out anything electrical or gas supply related, because those had faster emergency responses. A mechanical fault in the ventilation system, probably the primary intake. Probably a pressure issue that the automatic failsafe had failed to catch, which meant the failsafe itself had a secondary fault, which meant whoever they'd called wasn't a ventilation specialist. He was a general technician, and a general technician confronting an interdependent. Mechanical failure in a commercial kitchen system on a Friday night was going to take considerably longer than 40 minutes. He knew this the way he knew things, not with drama, but with the flat, undecorated certainty of someone whose entire career had been built on diagnosing cascading mechanical failures under conditions that did not allow for uncertainty. And the tiling alone was 3 weeks late because the contractor couldn't read a basic specification, which honestly tells you everything about the industry. "Excuse me a moment," Callum said. Nadine stopped mid-sentence. The interruption had come so cleanly, with so little apology attached to it, that she didn't immediately have a response. He was already standing. He crossed the dining room without hurry, moving in the direct, purposeful way of someone who has a destination and is not interested in being redirected. The duty manager was still at her station, now with a printed floor plan spread on the narrow desk. A-T-U-E-E, pen in her hand, and the fixed expression of someone solving a problem they weren't trained to solve. He stopped in front of her. "The kitchen's got a ventilation fault," he said. It wasn't a question. She looked up at him with the polite wariness of someone whose evening had already exceeded its allotment of complications. "Sir, I apologize for any disruption. We're working to resolve—" "Is it the primary intake? Pressure buildup in the extraction housing?" A pause. Behind her eyes, the arithmetic changed. "I'm sorry, how did you—" "Your technician's 40 minutes out." He said it without inflection. "You've got a seized valve on the primary relief. Probably the coupling, not the valve body itself, which means the secondary panel will have a compatible backup unit if the maintenance kit's been kept current." He glanced toward the corridor that ran behind the kitchen. "Maintenance access is through the service corridor?" She stared at him for a moment with the specific expression of a person encountering something that doesn't fit the category they'd assigned it to. Then slowly, she pointed left. "Before I tell you what happens in that corridor, smash that like button if you knew from the beginning that this man was different. Subscribe with the bell on, because the moment this whole restaurant realizes what they almost missed, that's coming, and you do not want to see it in someone else's comment." He moved toward the corridor without waiting for her to decide whether to allow it. Behind him, the dining room continued its evening. Wine poured, conversations threaded, candles burning low in their holders. Nadine Ashford sat at the corner table with an unfinished sentence and a cooling starter and the faintly disbelieving look of someone whose narrative had just walked away from them. At the private dining room entrance, a door opened briefly, and a woman stepped out into the main corridor for air, a press lanyard around her neck, a glass of water in her hand. She stopped when she saw the man walking toward the service corridor. She looked at him for 3 full seconds. Then she looked again. The kitchen was breathing again. That was how Osei Tamboli experienced it. Standing at his pass, hearing the ventilation system resume its low, steady pull, feeling the pressure in the extraction housing normalize with the particular mechanical sigh of a system returning to balance. 3 weeks of preparation, 50 covers in the private room. The most important dinner of his professional life, and it had nearly ended not with a bad review, but with a seized coupling on a Friday night. He pulled off his right glove and pressed his palm flat against the ventilation panel the way a doctor checks a pulse. Steady, consistent, alive. He came out of the kitchen still in his whites. The dining room recalibrated around his appearance the way rooms do when someone enters who belongs somewhere else. Conversations dipping briefly, eyes moving, an involuntary collective attention. Osei didn't notice. He was looking for one specific person, and he found him at the corner table near the window, sitting with a water glass and the unhurried composure of a man who had done nothing worth mentioning. He stopped at the table. The woman across from Callum looked up at Osei with the bright, reflexive recognition of someone who understood the social currency of a head chef appearing tableside. She straightened slightly. Osei wasn't looking at her. "You fixed it," he said to Callum. Not a question, a statement requiring confirmation. Callum looked up. Coupling on the primary relief. The secondary panel had a compatible backup. Your maintenance kit was current, which helped. He paused. You'll want a full inspection within 72 hours. The failsafe needs looking at. Osei studied him for a moment. Then he pulled out the empty chair beside the table, not Nadine's side, the adjacent one, and sat down with the decisive informality of a man in his own establishment who has earned the right to sit where he likes. "Who are you?" he said. Callum's expression shifted almost imperceptibly. Not discomfort exactly, but the slight adjustment of a man being asked a question with a longer answer than the moment seemed to call for. "Callum," he said, "I'm a mechanic." Osei looked at the replaced coupling Callum had set on the edge of the table. The seized brass fitting, oxidized at the threads, worn in the specific way of a component that had been running past its service interval. He picked it up and turned it over in his hands with the slow attention of someone reading a story in an object. "A mechanic," he repeated. "My own shop." Osei set the coupling down. He had come from nothing, a shipping container kitchen in Accra at 17, a dishwashing job in London at 20, 15 years of deliberate, unglamorous accumulation that had eventually produced saffron and salt. He knew what competence looked like when it had been carried quietly for a long time. He recognized the particular stillness of a person who had stopped needing to announce themselves. "Where did you learn that?" he said, not the polite version of the question, the real one. Callum was quiet for a moment. "I worked with pressurized systems for a long time," he said, "in a different context." "What context?" A pause. The candle between them burned without moving, the air suddenly very still. "Motorsport," Callum said. Nadine made a sound that was almost a laugh, the short, reflexive kind that escapes before social judgment can intercept it. She converted it, not entirely successfully, into a clearing of her throat. Osei's eyes moved to her briefly, then back to Callum with the unhurried focus of a man who has decided where the interesting part of the room is. "Motorsport," Osei said. "For a while." "What did you do in motorsport?" It was the third time Osei had pushed, and each time Callum had given him slightly less than the question deserved, and they both knew it. Osei waited with the patience of a man who had reduced stock for 6 hours and understood that some things could not be rushed. Callum looked at the coupling on the table, then at his water glass, then briefly at some middle distance that seemed to contain a calculation about how much the moment required of him. "I ran a team," he said finally. "Pit crew, race engineering." Osei was still. "Formula One?" he said. Callum said nothing, which was its own answer. From 2 tables away, the adjacent couple had stopped pretending not to listen. The man who had looked at his bread plate during Nadine's dress code comment was now watching Callum with an entirely different quality of attention. Even Nadine had gone quiet, her wine glass arrested halfway to her mouth, the practiced social geometry of her face doing something it rarely did, recalculating. And from the corridor, unhurried footsteps moved toward them. Priya Nair walked the way people walk when they're used to moving through rooms that weren't designed with them in mind, efficiently, without apology, with the press lanyard from the private motorsport dinner still hanging around her neck and a glass of water held loosely at her side. She'd stepped out for air 10 minutes ago. She'd seen a man moving toward the service corridor with the specific purposeful economy of someone who knew what they were walking toward, and something in the back of her mind had snagged on it the way a detail snags when your subconscious recognizes something your conscious attention hasn't caught up to yet. She'd waited in the corridor. She'd watched him come back out 11 minutes later, with a seized coupling in his left hand and the composed, slightly distant expression of a person returning from a task that had required everything and shown nothing. And she'd stood very still, because in 12 years of covering engineering and technology and motorsport, she had interviewed perhaps 30 people who moved and thought and carried themselves like that. Maybe fewer. She knew one of them by name who had disappeared 4 years ago without ceremony or explanation, who had declined every interview request, who had left a sport that had spent a decade depending on his judgment and had simply stopped, filed his patents, gone quiet, become nobody in particular. She stopped at the edge of the table. Osei looked up. Callum looked up. Nadine looked up with the particular attentiveness of someone recalibrating which person in the room currently held the most social weight. Priya wasn't looking at any of them, except Callum. "Callum Bryce," she said. It was not a question. It had none of the upward inflection of uncertainty. It was a statement, flat and precise, the verbal equivalent of placing a document on a table. Callum held her gaze for a moment. Something moved behind his eyes. Not alarm, not calculation, but the quiet recognition of a man who has kept a door closed for 4 years and is watching someone put their hand on the handle. "Yeah," he said. Priya exhaled once through her nose. Not dramatically, just the breath of someone whose subconscious has been vindicated, and pulled out the adjacent chair and sat down with the unself-conscious directness of a journalist who long ago stopped waiting to be invited into conversations. She set her water glass on the table, looked at the seized coupling, looked at Osei, looked back at Callum. "You fixed the ventilation system," she said. "The coupling was seized," he said. "Of course it was." She said it without irony, which made it land with more weight than irony would have. She turned the coupling over in her hand the way Osei had, but where Osei had read craftsmanship in it, Priya was reading a story. "Your secondary failsafe had a wiring fault too, I'm guessing," she said to Osei. "That's why the automatic shutoff didn't trigger." That's what he said, Osei confirmed, with the tone of a man who is rapidly revising the organizational chart of this conversation. Priya nodded once. Then she looked at Callum with the level, unornamented attention of someone who has spent a career sitting across from people who are more comfortable with machines than with being seen. "You've been here the whole time," she said. "In this city." "Few years," he said. "Running a garage." "Yeah." She was quiet for a moment. Not the silence of someone who has run out of things to say, but of someone choosing carefully between several things worth saying. If you've ever watched someone try to stay invisible and fail at the best possible moment, this is that scene. Subscribe with the bell on right now, because what Priya says next, and what this room does with it, is the part of this story that people are going to be talking about. "I wrote a piece when you left," she said. 4 years ago. Retirement. Announcement. 600 words. A brief pause. It got about 40 reads. Callum looked at her steadily. "That sounds right. You didn't want the attention." "No, you still don't." He didn't answer that one, which was also an answer. Priya set the coupling back on the table between them. Then she looked around the room, not the sweeping theatrical gesture of someone preparing a performance, but the quiet journalistic assessment of someone establishing context before committing words to it. She took in the dining room, the other diners, the couple at the adjacent table, the older man across the room, the duty manager standing at her station with the expression of someone who has been through an ordeal and not yet processed it. She took in Nadine Ashford, sitting with her wine glass and her green dress and her phone face down on the table, watching this unfold with the stillness of someone who has lost the thread of a conversation they thought they were running. Then Priya looked back at Callum, and something settled in her expression. "Can I tell them?" she said. Callum looked at his water glass, at the coupling, at the middle distance where Rosie lived in his mind, straightening his lapel, saying, "Go have fun," stating with complete conviction that her dad deserved someone nice. "Yeah," he said quietly. "All right." "Yeah," he said quietly. "All right." Priya didn't stand immediately. She took one more moment, the kind that separates people who speak for effect from people who speak because something needs to be said. She turned the water glass once in her hand, set it flat, and then pushed her chair back and stood. She didn't raise her voice. She didn't need to. The acoustics of saffron and salt, which Callum had clocked on arrival, did the work for her. The live marble, the low ceiling over the main floor, the way sound traveled in this room further than people expected. She'd been in enough press rooms, enough paddocks, enough post-race briefings, in temporary structures with worse acoustics than this to know exactly how much volume a room required. She addressed no one specifically, which meant everyone. "I want to tell you something about the man who just fixed your kitchen," she said. The dining room didn't go silent all at once. It went silent the way rooms do when something genuine enters them, in concentric rings, outward from the source, table by table, conversation by conversation, until the only sounds were the low mechanical breath of the now functioning ventilation system and the faint ring of a glass being set down somewhere near the back. "His name is Callum Bryce." She let the name sit for a moment. 11 years ago, he joined a Formula One team as a junior race engineer. Within 4 seasons, he was lead engineer. Within 7, he was running the pit crew operation. Strategy, execution, personnel, the whole technical architecture of a race weekend. She paused. If you follow motorsport, you know what that means. If you don't, It means that on race day, 40 seconds of his team's performance could be the difference between winning a world championship and finishing second. And his teams didn't finish second often. Osei had not moved. His hands were flat on the table, his attention completely undivided, the way a craftsman listens when someone describes work he understands the weight of. He holds 2 mechanical engineering patents, Priya continued. One in pressure regulation systems, which is why what happened in your kitchen tonight took him 11 minutes instead of 40. He managed a technical operation worth tens of millions annually and was considered, by the people inside that sport who don't give compliments easily, to be one of the best race engineers of his generation. The adjacent couple had turned fully in their chairs now. The woman who had laughed at Nadine's dress code comment was sitting with both hands in her lap, her expression carrying the specific discomfort of someone revisiting a recent decision. Her partner was watching Callum with the open, uncomplicated attention of someone who no longer had any interest in pretending to be elsewhere. 4 years ago, Priya said, and her voice shifted, not softer, but more careful, the way a journalist's voice shifts when they move from data to something that costs the subject more. He lost his wife, and he left, not with a press release, not with a farewell tour, not with the retrospective profile piece every outlet wanted to write. He just left, moved his daughter somewhere quieter, opened a garage, became, as far as the rest of the world was concerned, nobody in particular. The room held. Tonight he came here on a blind date. A brief pause. In the jacket he owns, and when your kitchen failed and your technician was 40 minutes away, and the most important dinner this restaurant has hosted this year was about to end before the main course, he got up from that table and fixed it. Because that's what he knew how to do. Because that's who he is, regardless of whether anyone in this room knew it. She stopped, not for effect, simply because she had said what needed saying and had nothing to add that the room couldn't now provide for itself. What the room provided was Osei Tamboli. He stood without theatrical deliberation. The way a man stands when standing is simply the honest physical expression of what he feels. He began to clap, not the loose, reflexive applause of social obligation, but the slow, deliberate kind that means something. The sound of it in the live acoustics of Saffron and Salt was very clear. The couple at the adjacent table stood, the man first, the one who had looked at his bread plate, and then his partner, whose expression had moved entirely past discomfort into something that looked like genuine feeling. The older man across the room stood without hesitation, as though he'd been waiting for permission. From the corridor that connected the private dining room to the main floor, the door opened. One person came through, then another, then several. The motorsport dinner guests, drawn by the quality of the silence that had preceded the applause, filtering into the main room with the slightly uncertain energy of people stepping into a scene already in progress. They looked at Priya, at Osei, at the room standing, and then several of them, who knew exactly what Callum Bryce's name meant, began to clap as well. Callum sat with his water glass and did not stand, and did not speak, and looked at the table in front of him with the expression of a man receiving something he had not asked for and was not entirely sure he deserved, and could not, in this moment, bring himself to refuse. Callum sat with his water glass and did not stand, and did not speak, and looked at the table in front of him with the expression of a man receiving something he had not asked for and was not entirely sure he deserved and could. Not in this moment, bring himself to refuse. The applause didn't crescendo the way applause does at events engineered for it. It built the way genuine things build, unevenly, organically, one person at a time, making an individual decision rather than a collective one. A woman near the window stood. Two men at the bar turned from their drinks. A server paused mid-step with a tray held level and watched with the open, uncomplicated expression of someone who had been in this room all evening and understood, perhaps better than anyone, what had just been corrected. Callum became aware of his own breathing. He was aware of the weight of the water glass in his hand, the specific temperature of it, the slight condensation against his palm. He was aware of the charcoal blazer on his shoulders, the one Rosie had approved, the one that had been photographed tonight as evidence of insufficiency, and of the way it sat on him now, in this room, with the same fit it had always had, unchanged, because nothing about it had ever been the problem. He was aware, most acutely, of Rosie. Not a thought exactly, more a presence. The way she was always a presence when the world did something unexpected, good or bad. He could see her with the clarity that grief and love produce equally. One arm around Captain the stuffed dog, the nightlight burning amber in her room, completely unconscious of the fact that her assessment of her father, that he was good, that he deserved good things, that the blazer was fine, had just been ratified by a room full of strangers in a restaurant she would never see. She would love that detail. He would tell her someday, some version of it, edited for age. Osei had not sat back down. He stood with his hands at his sides and watched the room with the expression of a man who had built something over 15 years and had just watched it be defended from a direction he hadn't anticipated. His kitchen was running. His private dinner was intact. The most important booking of his professional year was proceeding behind a paneled wall, because a man in a worn charcoal blazer had gotten up from a table where he was being mocked and fixed what needed fixing without being asked. He looked at Callum with the specific regard of one craftsman for another. Not admiration exactly, which implies distance, but recognition, which implies equality. Callum met his eyes briefly and gave the smallest nod. Osei returned it. At the table, Nadine Ashford had not stood. She sat with her wine glass and her green dress and the phone that had been face down since Priya began speaking, and she was very still in the way that people are still, when stillness is the only remaining form of control available to them. The room standing had not been directed at her. Nobody had looked at her, pointed at her, named her, or addressed her in any form. The reversal had not required her participation. That was in its way the most complete version of what had happened. She was not the story. She had tried to make herself the story, the authority, the arbiter, the one whose judgment organized the room, and the room had simply continued without her, had found its own center of gravity and oriented around it, and she had been left at the edge of it, present but unaddressed, like a footnote in a document about something else entirely. Her wine glass was still half full. She didn't drink from it. Priya had returned to her chair and sat with the quiet efficiency of someone who has filed a piece and is now simply present rather than working. She wasn't watching Nadine. She was watching Callum with the professional attentiveness of a journalist who has covered enough people to know that the most interesting moment is always what someone does with unexpected grace. What Callum did was breathe. He set the water glass down with the same steady hands that had set it down all evening. The same hands Nadine had photographed. the same hands that had rebuilt a transmission that morning and replaced a seized coupling an hour ago. And he looked at the room that was still, some of it standing for him. He felt something loosen in his chest. Not pride, not vindication exactly. Something older and quieter than either. The specific relief of a man who has carried a thing alone for a long time and has just briefly been allowed to set it down. He thought of Elena. He thought of her the way he always thought of her in moments that mattered, not with the sharp, destabilizing grief of the early years, but with the settled, permanent ache of someone who has learned to carry loss as weight rather than wound. She would have found tonight funny. She would have laughed, properly, the real laugh she reserved for things that genuinely surprised her. And then she would have squeezed his hand under the table and said something dry and perfect that he would have repeated to Marco the next morning. He missed her with the whole quiet mass of it. And then Rosie was there again in his mind, sleeping with one arm around Captain, and the missing shifted into something that resembled, improbably, gratitude. And then Rosie was there again in his mind, sleeping with one arm around Captain, and the missing shifted into something that resembled, improbably, gratitude. The room had begun to settle, not all at once, again, the way genuine things move, unevenly, person by person. People sat back down. Conversations resumed with the slightly altered texture of exchanges that have been interrupted by something real and are now finding their way back to the surface. The server who had paused with the tray completed his journey across the room. The bar resumed its low, steady business. Saffron and salt returned to itself, but not quite the same version of itself that had existed an hour ago. Rooms don't fully recover from moments like that. They absorb them and carry them forward, changed in ways that are difficult to articulate, but impossible to miss. Callum became practical. It was how he had always processed things that moved him, by finding the next concrete action and doing it. In the pit lane, it had been the debrief after the race, the data review, the setup notes for the next circuit. After Elena, it had been Rosie's school enrollment, the house, the garage lease, the methodical reconstruction of a life from its load-bearing elements. Now it was the bill. He picked up the small leather folder the server had left discreetly at the table edge sometime during Priya's account, when the room had been otherwise occupied. He opened it, looked at the number, closed it, reached into his jacket for his wallet with the same unhurried motion he brought to everything, and settled the bill in full, including a tip that was more than it needed to be, because the server had been courteous all evening, and courtesy deserved acknowledgement, regardless of what surrounded it. Nadine watched him do this. She said nothing. There was a version of this moment, Callum thought, where she might have offered to split it. A social reflex, an attempt at recalibration. But she didn't, and he hadn't expected her to, and it didn't matter either way. He tucked the wallet back into his jacket and looked at her for the first time in several minutes with the direct, unhurried attention he'd brought to the whole evening. She met his eyes, held them for a moment. Something moved across her face that was too complex and arrived too late to be called any single thing. He didn't need it to be named. "Thank you for dinner," he said. He meant it without irony and without warmth, in the exact neutral register of a man who had been raised to say the right thing, regardless of the circumstances surrounding it. She opened her mouth, closed it, gave a small nod that was the most unperformed thing she had done all evening. He stood, and Osei was there, not hovering, just present, in the way of a man who wanted to say something before the moment closed. He extended his hand, and Callum took it, and the handshake was the kind that happens between people who have established something real and don't need to dress it up. 72 hours, Callum said. I have a number, Osei said. Use it. Osei smiled, not the professional, tableside smile of a restaurateur managing an evening, but the real one with the specific quality of a man who has been in the industry long enough to have stopped expecting to be surprised by it. I'll be calling the garage, he said, not just about the inspection. Callum looked at him. I mean it, Osei said simply. Callum nodded once, and something about the exchange, its brevity, its completeness, felt like the kind of thing that becomes the beginning of a long story told years later in a different room. He turned to Priya. She was already standing, lanyard still around her neck, water glass empty. She looked at him with the clear, unsentimentalized regard of someone who has covered enough of the world to know that the good stories are almost always the ones nobody tried to make into stories. I won't write it, she said, unless you want me to. I don't, he said. I know, a pause. The garage, what's it called? Bryce's, she almost smiled. Original. It works, he said. He collected his blazer from the chair back, the charcoal one, the approved one, and put it on with the easy, unself-conscious motion of a man who has never needed a mirror to know how he carried himself. He looked at the room once, briefly, the same sweep he'd done on arrival, reading it as it now was, rather than as it had been. Different. He moved toward the exit, and the room let him go without ceremony, which was exactly what he would have wanted if anyone had thought to ask. Marco picked up on the second ring. How'd it go? He said. Callum pushed through the door into the cold night air and let it close behind him. Jacket was fine, he said. The jacket was fine, he said. Marco was quiet for exactly 2 seconds, the silence of a man processing a sentence that contained a complete story in 4 words. That bad? He said. No. Callum walked, hands in his pockets, breath misting in the cold air. The city moved around him with its usual Friday night indifference. Taxis, distant music, 2 people arguing cheerfully outside a kebab shop. It was an interesting evening. Interesting how? I'll tell you Monday. He reached his truck, 2 streets from the restaurant, parked where the rates were reasonable. Rosie asleep? Amara's mom texted an hour ago. Out cold. Captain's there. She's fine. Good. Callum. Marco's voice shifted. The particular gear change of a man who wants to apologize without knowing the full extent of what he's apologizing for. I'm sorry if she was... I didn't know she'd be... Marco. He unlocked the truck. It's fine. Genuinely. A pause. You sure? Callum looked back down the street toward the distant glow of saffron and salt signage, amber against the dark. Yeah, he said. I'm sure. He drove home. The city thinned around him as he left the center, the density of lit windows and moving people gradually giving way to quieter streets, wider gaps between street lamps, the particular peace of residential dark. He drove the way he did everything, without hurry, with attention. The truck smelled of motor oil, and the pine air freshener Rosie had chosen at the petrol station 3 months ago and insisted on, and he had never replaced it when it ran out, because the ghost of the scent still lingered, and she hadn't noticed, and he hadn't corrected her. He thought about the evening in the ordered, sequential way he thought about completed things. Nadine Ashford, her contempt, her performance, the specific loneliness of a person who needed witnesses for everything, including cruelty. He didn't dislike her. He understood her less than he'd hoped to, which was its own kind of disappointment, quiet and impersonal. He hoped she found whatever she was performing toward. He suspected it would take longer than she wanted. Osei Tamboli, the handshake, the real smile, the promise of a phone call that wasn't just about an inspection. Callum had not made a new friend in a long time. Not because he was closed to it, but because the life he'd built in this city was deliberately narrow, and narrowness had its own comfort. He thought about that, turned it over the way he turned over mechanical problems, examining it from different angles, checking for faults in his own reasoning. Rosie had told him he deserved good things. She hadn't specified what category. He pulled into his street and parked in the driveway and sat in the truck for a moment after the engine stopped, in the particular stillness of a vehicle that has just ceased moving and hasn't yet fully settled. The house was dark except for the small light he always left on above the kitchen sink and the faint amber glow in the upstairs window. Rosie's nightlight, burning with the steady reliability of something that knew its purpose. He went inside. The kitchen smelled of toast and the particular domestic warmth of a house that a child lives in. Crayons and laundry and something slightly sweet he couldn't identify. On the workstation beside the refrigerator, held in place by a magnet shaped like a London bus, was a drawing Rosie had made that week. A figure in a blazer standing beside a car, rendered in the confident, anatomically unconventional style of a 7-year-old who was not troubled by proportion. Underneath it, in the careful printed letters she'd been practicing, she had written, "My dad, the best mechanic." He stood in the kitchen and looked at it for a long moment. Then he went upstairs. Her door was already slightly open. He left it that way, always, and the nightlight cast the room in its familiar low amber. She was on her side, one arm around Captain, her hair spread across the pillow in the completely unguarded way children sleep when they have never been given a reason not to. Her breathing was even and slow, and the most uncomplicated sound in his life. He stood in the doorway the way he always stood there, making sure the world was still small and safe, and his. Checking that everything that mattered was where it was supposed to be. It was. He went to bed. He was at the garage by 7 the next morning. There was a car that needed him, and the work was honest. And outside the window, the day was beginning in the ordinary way that days begin when extraordinary things have already finished happening. Quietly, without announcement, as though the world understood that some people prefer it that way. And somewhere across the city, in a restaurant that was whole because of his hands, 50 people were still talking about the mechanic who hadn't said a word in his own defense. He didn't need them to. He never had. If this story hit somewhere deep, if you've ever been the person in the worn jacket who knew exactly what they were worth and just waited for the room to catch up, then you already know why we tell these stories. Drop a comment with one word that describes Callum. Just one. I want to see what you say. Subscribe and don't miss our next story. Trust me, you'll feel it. And tell me in the comments, what injustice should we tackle next?